Okay, so now as our viewers via YouTube join us, I would like to again welcome everyone to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tullahoma. We will begin with our chalice lighting. And this is entitled A Community of Faith by Judith L. Quarles. At this hour, in small towns and big cities, in single rooms and ornate sanctuaries, many of our sibling Unitarian Universalist congregations are also lighting a flaming chalice. As we light our chalice today, let us remember that we are part of a great community of faith. May this dancing flame inspire us to fill our lives with the Unitarian Universalist ideals of love, justice, and truth. And now we will move on to announcements. I will begin with saying that obviously we can't pass around an offering plate. However, if you wish to support the work of the church, you can send a check to P.O. Box 331, Tullahoma, Tennessee 37388. Are there any other announcements? Ricky.
Just another reminder for anybody who hasn't gotten the news, mark your calendars for May 8th. It's a Saturday. We are going to have a one-day church retreat get together up at Tim's Ford. And again, if anybody has any ideas for anything they would like to put on during the day, please email us, anybody at the board, or give one of us a call.
Okay, Chuck.
Let's see. Tom's not here and Rick's not saying anything, but we'll have our usual Wednesday night discussion group on Thursday night at 7:00. If anybody wants to join us and needs a Zoom link for that, let us know. What we've been doing is we watch a TED Talk or two and talk about it. And we have fun, so join us if you want. Let's see. And I wanted to mention that for those of us in Sewanee, it's down at Tim's Ford, not up at Tim's Ford. But we knew where you meant.
Okay. Are there any other announcements? Debbie.
We're still doing Wednesday Zoom at the church. Masks are required. We social distance and leave all the windows open. And that is Wednesday at 6. So all are welcome. Thanks.
Okay. Are there any other announcements? I'm just trying to make sure I don't miss anyone. Carrie.
You're muted, Carrie.
Okay. Our speaker next Sunday will be Michelle Peterson. She comes from the UU Church in the first UU Church in Nashville. And her talk will be Where Community Starts, Right Here Within.
Okay. I'm not seeing any more hands, so I will move on to our reading. And this reading is titled In Troubled Times by Stephen M. Schick. From the loneliness of troubled times we come to discover that we are not alone. Into the dwelling places of togetherness we come to collect remnants of hope. From the fear that all is lost, we come to discover what will save us. Into the comfort of each other's arms we come to feel the strength that has not yet vanished. From darkness we come to wait until our eyes begin to see. Into the refuge of fading dreams we come to remove illusions and focus new visions. From despair that walks alone we come to travel together. Into the dwelling place of generations we come, to pledge allegiance to being in peace and doing justice. And now, sorry, I'm trying to do live stream stuff while leading the service. And now we will have our sermon. Our speaker today is Denise Gyauch. Privilege is not free. The cost of racism and other oppressions.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be with you this morning. So first, I want to start by thanking Carrie, who put this book in front of my eyes. I think your eyes too. But she recently saw an interview with the author of a book. The author's name is Heather McGhee, and the book is entitled "The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Us and How We Can Prosper Together." And I'm doing a lot of anti-racism work right now. A lot of us UUs are. So I'm one of those, and the UU Ministers Association is rather insistent that we ministers need to be doing a lot of this anti-racism work right now. So I'm doing a lot, and we're doing a lot here in the congregation at First UU Nashville as well. But this book is like fresh off the press. It's just published last month. And it was exciting to read because she's drawing on lots of very recent interviews and the latest studies and other authors who've published within the last few years. And it's a very readable book, and I recommend it to you highly. And I'm going to try really hard not to do a book report for you. But there's so much good stuff in this book. And I kind of broadened the topic a little bit because I'm going to assume for the moment that everybody in this room identifies as white, and I don't know, you can't always tell just by looking that is the case. But we white people are dealing a lot right now with this idea of white privilege, and what does that get us? And how should we be feeling about it? And what should we be doing about it? And Heather McGhee's book, really the main thesis is that the way we have been living in this country, the way we have structured our society, our culture, our government, our communal life is not working particularly well for any of us. It works particularly badly for some people of color. You all know the list of people that there are all kinds of different oppressions that intersect and impact different lives differently. But we have this story about, well, the basic argument is that this culture, America, this country has always been built on a hierarchy of human value, where some human beings are the real ones, the most valuable ones, the most right, the ones to whom most of the privilege adheres, and the ones who benefit and make the money. And we are about at the end of how far that way of being in the world can take us. Besides all the uprisings and protests and movements for change and transformation, social transformation that are happening, there's also environmental change happening. It's going to, and now I'm moving beyond McGee's, her basic ideas, just to thinking about other people I've been reading lately. We're at a point where the environmental catastrophes unfolding around us are going to force us to reevaluate how we live together in this world, in our world, the world that our seventh principle affirms that we are all intimately connected to, that we are part of. It's not just a matter of the world affects us and we affect the world, but we are the world. The world is us. And we've been not paying attention, and we are going to have to pay attention soon. So there are old stories and myths. In McGee's book, The Sum of Us, she talks about the history of our country and talks about it as being built on some really old stories, and two in particular, this idea of a zero-sum reality, that basically if you get more, it's because I or somebody else gets less. There's only so much to go around. There's limited resources, and anybody's gain is somebody's loss. Right? So that's a story about how reality works that our country has lived with for a long time. And we do that both socially and economically. So that social status, my social status, somehow then impacts your social status. And then, of course, the economic it's really clear to see how that works. And the other story is this hierarchy of human value, where some human beings simply have more value and their needs are taken more seriously. And in our country, we have organized those stories, which are pretty common human stories. Most human societies have had some kinds of versions of those. But in this country, we organize those stories around race. Race was used early in our country to create unity among European white colonialists who had, back in Europe, they were fighting with each other all the time. They were part of separate cultural groups, ethnic groups. And here on this continent, as settlers, there was a need early in the early days of our country for them to unite, to kind of pull together to create a new country. They were doing, it was an experiment. It was something brand new. But they did that at the expense of other people. So we're hearing many voices these days about how our country was built upon the American reality that we all live, was built on the theft of land and labor, both. So in putting this sense of who we are as a people together, and also living with this theft, this injustice that is at the core of our being, there was a need for a story that would justify that. And there are, if you were at GA a few years ago, you heard about the doctrine of, I'm sorry, I should have looked this up before I decided to say something about it. Is it the Doctrine of Discovery? No, it's not that. It was Chuck's going to think of it. No, he's not. Maybe didn't mean to put you on the spot there, Chuck. But the idea that white Christian people almost had a duty to go in and save heathen people from themselves, to take their land if they refused to convert. It was something put forth by the Roman Catholic Church, but was used by all kinds of Christians, European Christians, as justification for various movements in the process of colonizing the whole continent. And there are people along the way. James Baldwin and Heather McGee quotes James Baldwin, who recognize that this cost white people something morally to do. It's bad behavior. You hear what it is that they're saying, and you go, well, that's not right. Let me see if I can find that quotation from James Baldwin. Said, white Americans, and this would have been in the 60s, I think, white Americans are dimly or vividly aware that the history they have fed themselves is mainly a lie, but they do not know how to release themselves from it, and they suffer enormously from the resulting personal incoherence. McGee talks also about the hidden wound, which is a phrase she took from Wendell Berry's book by that title. But Wendell Berry in 1968 published this book. And he said, for white people to free themselves from the debt of responsibility for racism, past and present, would be liberating. But there isn't well, actually, this is McGee. That was not a quotation from Wendell Berry. She's summarizing. But McGee points out that we don't have a path to that redemption. We don't know. I think we're in the moment where we are figuring that out, except it's not a moment. It's more like a season or maybe an epoch. But morally defending our position in this racially unequal society requires McGee says it requires fierce protection of your self-image as a person who earns everything you receive. So this is the story that got set up, is that white people somehow earned everything they got, even though it was stolen originally. And we all have gotten trapped into this culture where everything comes with a judgment about whether it's earned or unearned, and if it's unearned, it should be taken away. But mostly our story is, if you have it, you must have earned it, right? And it should be protected, and property is important to protect. And I don't want, we've put ourselves in a double bind. And what's interesting to me about this book, The Sum of Us, if you have heard interviews with the author, you'll know her favorite metaphor for this is emptying the pool. And I actually didn't realize it, but back in the 20s and 30s, there were a lot of public swimming pools. And now I'm thinking, gosh, you know what? My children have not known a summer where we go to a pool, because there aren't that many pools around in Nashville. You have to have a membership to the YMCA, or you have to buy a membership in a pool, a neighborhood pool kind of thing, they're kind of pricey. When they were itty bitty, we couldn't afford it, and we just kind of got out of the habit. But it used to be there were really lavish public pools, and they were available for everybody who was white. And when the civil rights era came in the 50s, the pools all got drained because the legality of keeping them segregated, was challenged. And municipalities and counties and states and cities all over the country filled in their pools rather than desegregate them. So everybody lost. The white people who could afford to build their own pools or their own neighborhood associations, they got to have nice pools, but the rest of us, most of us, didn't have pools anymore. And then McGee runs through lots of other ways where we lose. And we lose often because somebody somewhere has decided it's not okay to share this with people of color. So there's racism is used. Now, the interesting question that McGee raises is whether we have racism, and racism sets up dynamics that hurt particular people of color especially. But what if, instead of racism driving inequality for people of color, is it possible that racism drives inequality for everyone? Is it a tool being used by some people, the people who own the most, have the, money's gotten way concentrated in just a few hands, markedly in the course of our lifetimes. So it does look from a certain angle, and McGee describes this kind of thing over and over again through her book, that some people in certain positions of power and influence manipulate the stories about race in our culture in order to accrue gain and profit for themselves that actually hurts a whole lot of white people as well as people of color in our culture. And this happens with the swimming pools. It happens with education and healthcare, and access to education and healthcare, and funding for education and healthcare. It happens around labor organizing. It happens around voting rights. It happens around environmental degradation. And in fact, there is no way for most whites not to suffer when we take care of only a few people. Those white people, these mostly white people at the top who are accumulating tons and tons of wealth, are in fact not sharing it with most of the white people either. A lot of these racial policies and problems, not to take away from the fact that they hit people of color much more severely than they do people who are white. But the people who are white and at lower tiers of the economic structure also suffer because of those same policies in many cases. And often, I found this fascinating, often what happens is the people of color feel the injustice first, and they feel the economic consequences first, and then it spreads. And it doesn't just spread to poor white people, it spreads to middle class white people. This is why I'm convinced it's part of why the middle class has shrunk so much in the last several decades. So, for instance, with mortgages and subprime lending, that predatory mortgaging practices, they've been around for a long time in communities of color because of racism, just really blatant racism around how neighborhoods were marked as risky or not risky, depending really just solely on where the Black people lived. So that it made it very hard to get a good mortgage or any mortgage at all, or insurance or any insurance at all, if you lived in certain places in the country, or in a city. There are actually, it's redlining, if you hear that word. These neighborhoods, the all Black neighborhoods or the mostly Black neighborhoods were marked in red on the insurance company's charts. And, and the people funding mortgages look at those charts and say, oh no, you can't have a mortgage if you live in there. And of course, people of color are not welcome to live in neighborhoods that aren't redlined, but they can't get good mortgages, they can't get good insurance. So they do have access sometimes to loans that are really disadvantageous to them. And we have a period of time where these loans are marketed to people of color who can't get good loans from their banks. And the precedent is set up, the machinery, the company cultures of selling these, packaging these instruments, all of that happens. And then in the last 2 decades, many, many white people have also been, like in the Great Recession of 2008, a lot of people, white folks as well as people of color, got sort of caught in their need for money to survive the recession, being laid off or whatever, ended up in mortgages that they could not pay. They, were refinancing things and then eventually could not make their payments, and the mortgage companies, foreclosed on a lot of houses. It caused a lot of suffering. But the white middle class people suffered because the Black people had first, those systems of how to prey on people who are, who are economically vulnerable for whatever reason, was set up with sort of the African-American population got to be the guinea pigs, if you will, for how do we do this? How do we get as much money out of and get people out of their homes? And then boom, there are the white people, and it's happening to them as well. Voting rights, some of that is happening too. Lots of states are passing, and this is really recent, just the last few years, passing really odd ID requirements, for example. And McGee says that in a lot of those states, they specify which IDs are and are not allowed when you register or when you vote. And they choose those a lot of times in ways that are clearly racially skewed. They're harder for people of color sometimes in general to have than the general population. But they're doing it particularly targeting, trying to remove people of color from the voting rolls. So a lot of white people are getting caught up in that too, and youth. young people are less likely to own cars and have driver's licenses. And they may have student IDs, but they might not have gotten. This is very strange. The kids in high school right now, most of them don't care about their driver's license. I don't get it, but it's true. I mean, a lot of them are just really slow to get them. So, but then their student ID isn't good enough in some states to get it. So we're disenfranchising our youth of all colors, and we're disenfranchising other white people who don't have the right kind of identification for whatever reason. So racism is being used to drive inequality, economic inequality that impacts lots of people, not just people of color. There's a really interesting book that was published a few years ago by Jonathan Metzl. That's Metzl, and he's a Vanderbilt professor of. I wrote it down. Sorry. I think he's a professor of sociology and psychology. So or psychiatry. So he's an MD, a physician, but also apparently a sociologist. And he did a study called Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. And he studies gun control and the accompanying problem, especially of suicide, in Missouri. That's a case study. And he studies healthcare funding in Tennessee. We are a case study for this book. And education and funding and taxation for education in Missouri. And what he finds in those 3 case studies is that whites will cling to a racial hierarchy at the expense of our own good. That we have been so thoroughly convinced, and this goes back to the 17th century in our country, we have become so thoroughly convinced that if you've got nothing else, at least you've got your whiteness, that we will actually cut off our noses to spite our faces. We will go along with racist policies that harm us, or will refuse to vote for things that take care of all of us, that better the general good, the common good, if it means being on the same level as people of color. If we feel like it threatens our status as being at least one step better than the people of color. And this is not a pretty picture. It's not a pretty picture of who we are. And we are, in fact, hurting. We are the people of color are disproportionately poor compared to white people who identify and are recognized as white. But the majority of people who are poor are white. The majority of people who need the public services and the public goods that we all could be enjoying are white. And the people who don't have them when we won't share are often white. So we all hurt. To me, this is just sort of, this is a big textbook example of our 8th principle, that we are all interconnected. And especially when you throw the environmental impacts in, we are all affected. And sometimes I think in our culture, we like to pretend that interconnection is an optional thing. Well, what if I don't want to believe that? I've actually had people ask me that sometimes, once or twice. And I just kind of look at them and just go, well, I'm tough. If you don't want to believe it, tough. I'm not saying you should make this true. I'm saying this is true. We are connected. And Heather McGee in The Sum of Us makes a really compelling case that when we go blindly along with the racist stories and history and patterns of our country, we're missing out. And we're missing out on what she names solidarity dividends. When we actually work together across racial lines, when we work together as a human community for the common good, we all win. We all get lovely swimming pools. We all have better health insurance. We all have more access to the things we need and the things that make our lives worthwhile and livable. So it's a big project. It is a really big project. And what I'm really heartened about lately is there are more people writing things that are suggesting to us how we can work on this in ways that I think 10 years ago were kind of unimaginable. 10 years ago, I think we were stuck in the problems of race and racism as being rooted in prejudice. And I don't want to downplay that. That is so very real. And we all in this culture are affected by it, every single one of us. And the ways our brain work mean that we have implicit bias, all of us, and that's people of color and white people. And that was programmed into us by the fact that we live here and by the stories we have and the way we've told those stories. And it's really hard. You know, things get stuck in your lizard brain. That's the part that's fight or flight or freeze. But once it gets in there, it's hard to unroot it. But we're human beings. We aren't actually lizards. And so we can watch our lizard brains do these things. And we can choose to do otherwise. And we can choose to notice that, all this setting whites against immigrants and people of color and others, however we make those others, this us and them mindset, it really hurts us all. And it does benefit a few people, but it's not most of us. And we could make other choices. We could understand that more clearly. We could think about when somebody is saying, we can't do that because it will harm the economy. We can find out who actually gets harmed and who doesn't. It may not be the bulk of the people who have jobs and need, or working subsistence level to feed their families who get hurt. It may be the people who need to feel a real strong drive to maximize their own profits. They may get hurt, and they may call that hurting the economy. But we could choose to instead focus on what does this do at the level of most of us? And does it help most of us or hurt most of us? Not does it help overall profitability, which right now tends to go into very few pockets. So there are some people doing some really interesting work that's trauma informed. And you may or may not have heard of this work before, but some people are starting to apply this now to racism work. There's a really good book called My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. The author's name is Resmaa Menakem, and he's a therapist in Minneapolis. But he talks about how we all carry histories of trauma in our bodies. And neuroscience is really backing this up right now. And white people carry trauma from our European history that we brought to this continent, and then instead of dealing with it, imposed it upon people of color, indigenous peoples and African slaves, imported enslaved people from Africa, brought into this country. And we built this system on avoiding dealing with this trauma. And we created new trauma then for other people. And Menakem actually talks about white bodies and black bodies and police bodies and the trauma in those different kinds of bodies in a conversation that is very, very compassionate and actually has tools to suggest, concrete tools for learning how to process trauma. And so there's lots of new ways of addressing racism that involve being whole people, embodied people, people with emotions, people with ancestors who suffered, and who bring some of that in our brains and in our cells. And what can we do with that so that we all can live together in a way that is more satisfying, more fun, more just, more love for everyone. And there's so many writers and speakers of color right now who the things they say to us as they are talking about racism, and these are hard conversations often, but they are so full of love and compassion for all of us, for the white people and for the people of color and the indigenous peoples. And I think of Menachem and McGee's book, reads that way, but Brian Stevenson, who did a AWARE lecture at General Assembly a few years back, and he does the Economic Justice Initiative in Alabama at the Lynching Museum, and really hard stuff. And what he says to us is, look, you have to find the joy in your work. And look, we got to get rid of this judgment-based thinking that we do all the time, and this punishment and reward system that we do all the time, that we need to learn how to be human beings together in different ways. These are not people saying, you bad white people, you've been so awful, you should die now. They're not treating us the way we know we have treated others, we white colonial descended people. We are being invited into the project of envisioning a new way of being together as a culture. And I find that so hopeful and encouraging. And I want to leave you with, this is a little bit long for a reading, but it's near the end of Heather McGee's book. And she says this: the great lie at the root of our nation's founding was a belief in the hierarchy of human value, and we are still there. This moment is challenging us finally to settle this question: who is an American and what are we to one another? We have to admit that this question is harder for us than in most countries because we are the world's most radical experiment in democracy, a nation of ancestral strangers that has to work to find connection, even as we grow more diverse every day. But everything depends on the answer to this question: who is an American? And what are we together? And what are we to one another? Politics offers two visions of why all the peoples of the world have met here. One in which we are nothing more than competitors, and another in which perhaps the proximity of so much difference forces us to admit our common humanity. The choice between these two visions has never been starker. To a nation riven with anxiety about who belongs, many in power have made it their overarching goal to sow distrust about the goodness of the other. They are holding on white-knuckled to a tiny idea of we the people, denying the beauty of what we are becoming. They're warning that demographic changes are the unmaking of America. What I've seen on my journey, and let me say, McGee's book, she's traveled all over the country. She's a public policy analyst. So she studied the sociological, the analytical, the demographic, the statistics, all of that. And she's talked a lot with individual people. And you get all of that in her book. It's fabulous. So what I've seen on my journey is that the demographic changes, they're the fulfillment of America. What they say is a threat is in fact our country's salvation. For when a nation founded on a belief in racial hierarchy truly rejects that belief, then and only then will we have discovered a new world. So, friends, my hope is that it will be so, and that we will be part of making it so. May it be.
Thank you. That was an excellent talk, and I'm looking forward to talk back. And so now we come to our closing. As we leave this friendly place, love give light to every face. May the kindness we will learn light our hearts till we return.
And so it is.
We will now take a short break. Let's see, it is 10:56. So let's take a 10-minute break so everyone's got a chance to refill their coffee and whatever else they need to do. So we will meet back here at about 11:05 for talk back.